Sometimes I feel like my whole life up to that point was like an old videotape rewound all the way back to the beginning. The monotonous landscapes of suburbia, the familiar faces at school, the same routes around the city. All of this was suddenly replaced by a new, bright, noisy movie in the genre of drama with elements of chaos. That's exactly how I felt during my first few days in New York City. My name is Jacob, but everyone just calls me Jake. I'm 19, and I come from a tiny town in Pennsylvania where the main attraction was an abandoned movie theater from the 50s. Everyone there knows each other by name, and any event from a falling tree to the changing colors of City Hall is discussed on the benches in front of the houses. Everything was predictable and simple, until one day I received my acceptance letter to New York University of the Arts. I remember that moment down to the smallest detail. A white envelope with the university's coat of arms in the corner. I opened it right on the front porch and stood there, not believing my eyes as the cool fall wind moved the pages of the letter. My hands were shaking, but it wasn't nervousness, it was joy mixed with shock. A couple of weeks later, I was standing at the bus station with 2 suitcases, feeling like the hero of some big life change movie. New York City greeted me with a noise I had never heard before. It wasn't just a sound, it was a hum that filled everything around me. The honking of cars, the stomping of footsteps, muffled voices in the background. It all made it feel as if the city itself was a living thing that breathed, moved, and spoke. Barely stepping off the bus, I froze on the sidewalk, feeling like a small fish that had accidentally swam out into the open ocean. People were moving quickly, confidently, no one was looking around. Everyone was immersed in their own work, and it seemed an incredible contrast to the leisurely streets of my hometown. I rented a room in a small old house on the outskirts of Brooklyn. I knew from the pictures on the website that it wasn't going to be a 5-star hotel, but when I stepped inside, I realized it was going to take some getting used to. The wooden floor creaked, the windows didn't close all the way, and the bathroom was shared on the floor. But this was New York City. My first night passed to a million sounds from the street. The sirens of police cars, someone's loud laughter outside the window, and the distant bass of music playing somewhere around the corner. I lay on the hard mattress and stared up at the ceiling, feeling a mixture of fear and excitement growing inside me. The morning started early. The sun shone through the gaps in the old curtains, painting the room with orange light. The kitchen smelled like someone's burnt toast. I threw on a sweatshirt and went outside. It was my first day in New York for real. Everything looked different in the daylight. It turned out that the house I'd seen at night was painted a warm yellow, and the brick walls of the neighboring building were decorated with bright graffiti. People were rushing to work, not paying the slightest attention to me, and I suddenly realized that this was exactly what I liked. Here you are not Mr. Wilson's son from the next street. Here you are just a person among many others. I decided to walk to the university. It took longer than I had anticipated, but I didn't regret a second of it. Each new block was like a new chapter of a book. Coffee shops with windows displaying fresh croissants, old stores with signs from the last century, street vendors with carts that carried the aroma of roasted chestnuts. New York is loud and quiet, bright and gray at the same time. On every corner I noticed something new. A sign with a strange inscription, a homeless man with a homemade sign, 3 young guys breakdancing right on the street corner. As I approached the university building, I stopped for a few seconds. The tall glass walls glistened in the sun, and I felt a prick of doubt. It all looked too big, too serious. At times like this, questions begin to play in my head. Is this really the place for me? What if I can't handle it? But I already knew how to fight it. Just take the first step, I thought, and my feet carried me forward on their own. The first thing that struck me inside the university was the smell. A mixed aroma of coffee, paper, and fresh paint. The people around me were completely different. Some in ripped jeans and a t-shirt with acid prints, some in a perfectly ironed shirt and an expensive watch. But no one looked at the others with judgment. There was a sense of freedom here. In the auditorium, I took a seat by the window and started looking at my group. My desk mates were flipping through the pages of thick laptops with complex 3D models and digital drawings on their screens. Someone was already a couple of steps ahead of me, but that didn't scare me. The class began with an introduction to the basics of the course. We were told about the schedule, assignments, and requirements. It all sounded exciting and intimidating at the same time. At home, I could afford to do things at my own pace, but here I would have to compete with dozens, maybe hundreds, of students who were just as eager to get here. By evening, I came home tired but full of thoughts. I opened my laptop to write a letter to my parents about how my first day went, but I changed my mind. There was too much to tell, but I didn't know where to start. With the hum of cars or the smell of coffee at the university, from the room that was more like a closet or the contrasting streets and huge buildings. I decided to put off writing until tomorrow. Since then, I've thought every night before bed about how New York is more than just a city. It's a place where you feel yourself changing every day. Even in one night on a hard mattress, you start to realize that you don't want to go back anymore. It was my first day, but I already knew. There were many first steps ahead. It had been a week since I'd moved to New York. 7 days, but it felt like an eternity. The city no longer deafened me with its noise as it had on my first day. Now that constant hum became a background sound, like the wind or rain outside the window. My brain learned to ignore it, and I began to recognize its rhythm. The morning hum was hurried, as if someone was turning up the volume on their headphones. In the afternoon, it became softer, and by evening a new, evening noise was building up. A mixture of voices from street cafes, music from bars, and police car sirens. But it wasn't the noise that was the biggest challenge for me. The biggest challenge was my own thoughts. The confidence with which I had walked the university corridors on the first day quickly dissolved. With each new class, I began to realize how high the bar was. The guys here weren't just talented, they were geniuses in their fields. Some could draw an anatomically accurate hand in 5 minutes, others could assemble complex 3D models in a couple hours. I sat next to them and felt a lump grow in my throat. In the third Design Basics class, the instructor asked all of us to show our best work to gauge our level. My heart beat faster when I heard this assignment. I pulled out my laptop and opened a folder of projects I'd done back home, posters, simple logos for local clubs, and a few experimental abstract illustrations. Everyone in my town said I had real talent, but in this classroom, I suddenly saw my work differently. Next to the other students' work, mine seemed too simple and ordinary. When it was my turn, I put my illustrations on the screen. My heart was racing. The instructor, a short man with thick dark hair and a sharp gaze, was silent for a long time, squinted his eyes even harder, and finally nodded. Said it was not bad, but needs development. Those words crashed into my head harder than any direct criticism. Not bad, but not good either. In a gray area. And at this university, I realized, to stay in the gray zone is to drown. After class, I went outside and slowly walked to the subway. The same thoughts kept running through my mind. Maybe I was wrong? Maybe I'm not ready for this level? I saw other students discussing their work, laughing, agreeing to meet in the evening. They had already made friends, created their own little hobby clubs, and I was walking alone along the street, clutching my backpack to my back, as if it were the only reliable anchor in this endless sea. That evening was the first time I felt lonely. It was quiet at home, except for the sound of the street outside my window. My floormates had been missing somewhere all day, and I had hardly seen them. The small room seemed even smaller when you were alone in it with your thoughts. I opened my laptop and looked at my artwork again. I looked at them for a long time, zooming in on the details, trying to see what was not bad and what needed to be developed. But the longer I looked, the more it seemed to me that all this was useless. Still, I didn't give up. The next day, I went to the university library. I saw rows and rows of books on art, graphics, photography, digital design. I grabbed 3 random textbooks off the shelf and opened the first section I came across. Read a few pages, made a few notes in my notebook. With each new page, I could feel my mind waking up. I wanted to try something new. I got home and sat down at my laptop. I turned on some music, a quiet instrumental track I found randomly on the internet, and started drawing. It wasn't an order, it wasn't homework, it was just an experiment. I removed all the usual techniques and tools I had used before and started from scratch. This time I decided not to plan the final result, but to go for inspiration. Lines became shapes, forms became images. At some point I realized that what I had in front of me was not just a pattern, but a city. New York Island, with its chaotic street lines, tiny houses, high-rises, and bridges. It was simple, but there was something real about it. The next day, I showed the work to my teacher. I didn't expect any particular reaction. I just wanted to figure out which way to go next. But this time, he lingered at my screen longer than usual. "Interesting vision of space," he said, not looking at me but continuing to look at the work. "Find your style in this," he added, and walked away to the next student. Those words stuck in my mind. Find your style in this. What did that mean? How do you find style in something you did by accident? I spent the rest of the week trying to answer that question. I was no longer sitting in lectures, tucked away on my phone or in my notebook. I was drawing strange, abstract patterns in the margins of my notes, experimenting with shapes and contours. After lectures, I would go to the library and look for books that could tell me how artists of the past found their styles. I learned that it was always a long process, that the great masters searched for their techniques for years. At one point, I caught myself thinking that the same old fear was no longer in my head. There were still questions, yes, but the fear was gone. I stopped comparing my work to other people's. I focused on making something new, something of my own. It was difficult. It's easier to repeat old techniques and be not bad. But I realized that wasn't going to work here in this town. Saturday morning, I left the house and went for a walk around the city. Took a notebook and a pen with me. Just walked around and drew what I saw around me. People at bus stops, old people on benches, shadows from wires on sidewalks, leaves stuck in the grates of storm drains. It all turned out to be much more interesting than it seemed at first glance. I began to notice the rhythm of the city not only in its sounds, but also in its shapes. The lines of the streets, the curves and contours of the shadows. When I got home, my sketchbook was almost full. That night, I fell asleep with the feeling that the day had not been wasted. Another week passed, and I was once again sitting in a university auditorium. This time, I wasn't afraid to show my work. When the instructor stopped by my laptop and looked at the new project again, he nodded. "That's getting closer to the point," he said as he walked away to the next student. I sat back with a slight smile, looking at the screen. This time his words didn't sound like criticism. Get to the point. It meant I was on the right track. And I realized that this was just the beginning for me. New York doesn't become your home right away. It tests you, puts up barriers, makes you doubt yourself. But if you endure, if you search, experiment, and are not afraid to make mistakes, one day you will realize that you are no longer a guest. You are part of this city. They say that New York either takes you in or spits you back out. I heard this phrase from an older student in class. At first, I thought of it as just another high-profile metaphor. But now, after a month of living here, I understand its meaning. The city tests you every day. It doesn't do it on purpose. It's just its nature. You either learn to swim in its turbulent current or you drown. I started to feel more confident. I didn't look around in the subway anymore, and I wasn't afraid that someone would judge my appearance. I walked the streets like a local who knew where he was going. At least it looked that way on the outside. In reality, I still felt like the new kid. But now I knew how to hide it. The highlight of these weeks was an assignment in the Creative Concepts course. We had to create a series of 3 illustrations on the theme, city lines. It seemed simple. What could be simpler than that? But the more I thought about the assignment, the more difficult it became. The teacher made it clear that he was expecting not just pictures of buildings or roads, but something that would reveal the very essence of the city. I wandered the streets looking for inspiration. I looked up at the lines of skyscrapers that crisscrossed each other like a wicker basket. I looked down at the sidewalks, riddled with shadows from poles and grates of storm drains. But it was all too obvious. A city isn't just lines of buildings, I thought as I sat on the steps of an old house in Brooklyn and leafed through a sketchbook. At some point, it hit me. I saw an old lady carrying a cat in her arms. Her coat was made of plaid fabric and a shopping net hung from her elbow. Behind her, a man with headphones and a backpack over his shoulder walked slowly. Their silhouettes intersected, their lines of motion crisscrossed. In that moment I realized, the lines of a city are not only architecture, they are also people, their routes, their paths through the city. These lines are invisible, but they are real. With this thought, I returned home and started working. This time I didn't open old projects or look for inspiration on the internet. I pulled out a sketchbook that had sketches of people on the streets and started redrawing them on a tablet. I had the idea to depict 3 intersections of people's paths. In the first scene, an ordinary pedestrian zebra, where silhouettes of people diverge in different directions, their steps are like threads that stretch in different directions. In the second scene, a subway car, where the lines of hands holding the handrails intersect with the lines of windows and seats. In the third scene, I depicted a park where a jogger, a guy on a bike, and a young mom with a stroller intersected on a path. The work dragged on for several nights. I woke up to the sound of my alarm clock and felt my back ache from sitting at my desk for so long. But I was content. This was my first job that I felt owned. It was alive. When presentation day came, I was less nervous than I expected. The other students' work was impressive. A guy from Japan created illustrations in the style of traditional Japanese prints, but featuring New York City. A girl from Brazil made collages of old photographs and modern graphics. It was incredible. My turn came near the end. I put my work on the screen and my heart started to beat faster again. The teacher nodded slowly, looking at the screen. He took a long look at the second illustration with the subway car. Interesting use of motion lines, he said. But can you make it even more subtle? Can you see not just the people, but the architecture itself within their movements? I didn't immediately realize what he meant, but those words hooked me. They didn't seem like a criticism. Rather, they were a new challenge. After class, I went to the subway and watched. This time, I wasn't just looking at people. I was watching their movements. A woman opens her bag and pulls out her phone the line of her hand. A man adjusts his backpack, the line of his shoulder and elbow. An elderly man slowly steps over the threshold of the wagon. His line of motion breaks and aligns again. I began to see more than before. A few days after that class, I happened to come across an ad. It was a poster for a competition for young designers. I had to create a poster for a charity event supporting animal shelters. I took a picture of the ad and saved it to my phone. The idea to participate in the contest was in my head, but there were doubts. Contests are a risk. It means you'll be judged by people who don't know you personally. My inner voice whispered, "You're not ready yet," but another voice replied, "When will you be ready? In a year? In 10? One evening, I just opened my laptop and started working on a poster idea. I decided to focus on simplicity and emotion. Instead of the usual image of a sad dog behind bars, I made a minimalistic image of a silhouette of a dog that had one missing piece, like a piece of a puzzle. This fragment I replaced with a silhouette of a human hand that fills the void. The meaning was clear. The human is a part of the animal's life that completes it. This idea was born in a couple of minutes, but perfecting it took 3 days. I polished lines, played with shadows, changed fonts, over and over again. Sometimes I'd stop and think it wasn't going to work, but I kept going. When I submitted the poster to the contest, there was a strange calm inside me. For the first time, I didn't care if I won. I loved the very feeling of completion. A week went by. I was in the library, immersed in my composition textbooks, when a notification arrived on my phone. Opening the message, I saw, "Congratulations! Your poster is one of the top 5 finalists in the contest." At that moment, I felt a wave of warmth run through my body. I almost screamed with joy, but all around me was the silence of the library. People were sitting at tables, leafing through books and working at laptops. I took a deep breath, tucked my phone in my pocket, and smiled. Later, on the way home, I had one thing on my mind. Winning was cool, but it was much cooler to feel like you were capable of doing something important, something real. New York City no longer felt like a monster testing me. Now it was a partner who throws down challenges and expects me to accept them. I realized that this city won't wait for you to be perfect. It expects you to take action despite your doubts. I knew now that I was ready to take on challenges. It didn't matter what came next. The important thing is to keep moving. The lines of the city change every day, and I became part of those lines. If someone had told me 6 months ago that I would stand on a stage in front of hundreds of people and receive an award for my design project, I would have only grinned. But that's exactly what happened. It all started with that poster for the contest. My work didn't win first place, but it wasn't the last either. I was in the top 3 winners. The organizers called me to invite me to the awards ceremony, which was to be held at a large cultural center in Midtown. When I got that message, everything turned upside down inside of me. I was expected where successful designers and creative people in the city usually gather. A place that until a couple months ago seemed too soon for me to even enter. But here I was, standing in front of the big mirror in my room, trying to decide what to wear. The closet was modest, a couple sweatshirts, jeans, and a couple shirts I'd brought from home. I didn't have anything award-appropriate to wear. I ended up wearing a black t-shirt, a shirt over top, and my old sneakers. What was going through my head was, be yourself, don't try to seem like someone else. The gym was huge. High ceilings, warm light from the lamps, and large screens projecting the finalists' work. My name flashed in the corner of the screen, and it was a strange feeling to see it there among the other names. People were coming up to each other, discussing the work, some nodding, some clicking photos on their phones. I felt small, like a mouse in a room full of cats. But with each step through the hall, this feeling went away. The ceremony began with a speech by the organizers. First, they talked about the purpose of the contest, the importance of helping animal shelters. I was standing in the corner of the hall, listening to someone talking about how important it is to take care of those who cannot take care of themselves. Suddenly it hit me that it was about me, too. At some point, New York City became as much of a shelter for me as these animal centers. It gave me a place to find myself, if you just look. When they started announcing the winners, I felt everything inside me freeze. My name came second, Jacob Wilson, for his work, part of something more. Hearing my name, I froze for a second, and then I felt someone lightly slap me on the back. It was one of the finalists, a guy with dreadlocks, who smiled at me and nodded towards the stage. I got up there slowly, as if in a dream. The spotlight was hitting my eyes, and the faces of the people in the audience seemed like blurry silhouettes. But I could see the screen where my poster had been magnified several times. The silhouette of a dog and a hand filling its empty space. I suddenly realized it wasn't just an image, it was my own story. I too was part of the city, part of this huge machine. The organizer of the contest shook my hand, handed me a small certificate and an envelope with the inscription, Project Development Grant. Inside was a check for an amount that would be enough to pay my room rent for several months in advance. It was like a dream. I stood holding the envelope, feeling like I had done something truly important. After the ceremony, several people approached me. One man, in his 40s, introduced himself as the art director of a design studio in Lower Manhattan and said he'd like to talk about a possible internship. I tried not to look too excited, but it was like fireworks had turned on inside me. We exchanged contacts, and I promised to text him in the next few days. In the evening, I walked home. The city was living its life again. Car headlights, the noise of the streets, someone's voice in the distance. I stopped at the crosswalk, looking at the glowing lights of Manhattan in the distance. There was always something wrong with those lights. They're bright, but their light is cold. But in that moment, they seemed warmer to me than before. When I got home, I took off my sneakers and lay straight on the bed without taking off my clothes. There was an old plafond looking up at me from the ceiling, peeling around the edges. It was ugly, but somehow familiar. I felt a sense of peace rise in my chest. For the first time ever, I realized that I didn't need to be someone else. No need to try to fit in. It was enough to just be myself. The days started to go by faster. Everything went on as usual at university, but now I felt more confident. No longer afraid to show my work, no longer comparing it to the work of others. I started sharing ideas with my classmates, and sometimes I gave advice myself. It was a new feeling for me to not be afraid of being judged. The internship that man talked about turned out to be real. 2 weeks after the ceremony, I showed up for an interview at his studio. It was a small but cozy office on the second floor of an old building. Wooden floors, racks of books and plants on the windowsills. I was offered to try my hand at a few small projects. At first they were simple tasks, help with preparing files, retouching images. But soon I was commissioned to create a logo concept for a client. Working on the logo was challenging. I drew and erased, created new variations, and went back to the old ones. The client wanted something simple but strong, and it was the most abstract brief imaginable. But I found a solution. Again, I used the same idea I had used in my poster, the idea of part of a whole. This time it was a logo where the letters were made up of missing pieces, as if they could be put together like a jigsaw puzzle. The client loved it. This success became more than just a completed task for me. I began to realize that every step, even the smallest, leads to something bigger. One evening I was walking across the Williamsburg Bridge on my way home. To the left was a view of Manhattan at night, the lights of skyscrapers reflected in the river. People walked past me, joggers, bicyclists, tourists with cameras. Everyone was part of this endless stream that doesn't stop for a second. I looked at them and suddenly realized, we are all going somewhere. Every person on this bridge, every pedestrian on the street, everyone has a goal, a route, a line of travel. Lines cross, sometimes diverge, but always moving forward. It was the same principle that I embodied in my work. I smiled to myself. New York no longer seemed cold or indifferent to me. It was a huge organism that breathed and lived its life. And I was part of that organism. Now I knew for sure. This city doesn't push you out. It just looks at you and waits for you to take the first step. The key is to keep going. And I knew for sure that I would not stop.